you all for allowing me to be here. I'm Diane Douglas. I'm honored and privileged to be your Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction. And let me tell you just a little bit about how I got here. I'm a miracle. I'm a political miracle standing in front of you. In the primary, I decided to get into this race in August of 2013. I was running against an incumbent who had been in office, different offices, for 30 years. There's no way I should have won that election, and yet I did. Then we went on to the general election. I was a clean elections candidate, which gives you roughly $146,000 in funding to run a campaign through the general election. My opponent, if I remember correctly, had over $300,000 in his campaign war chest, so I was outspent 2-to-1. In the independent expenditure money, or the quote-unquote dark money, as some people call it, we were outspent almost 700-to-1. And it is just, I believe that it was divine intervention and the very hard work of so many of you. So I applaud you and thank you for everything that you did. It's an honor and a privilege to serve you. And I brought a couple of things I want to share with you today. So need some notes so I won't forget. One of the things you may have heard, we're out on a little listening tour, and I'll talk about that again in a little bit. But we were down in, I think it was Chandler. I can't remember if it was Chandler or Scottsdale, one of the two last weekend. And a gentleman came up to the podium and he spoke about, and questions are rhetorical in that forum, but he asked what was my legacy, what did I want my legacy to be as superintendent? And he asked that again as I left, and I thought I'd think about that a lot, and I did, but I want to share with you, my legacy is that we will have the best educated children we can possibly have, and educated to fulfill their dreams, their wishes, and their goals for their future, not as some bureaucrat may determine it for them, and that they will be well educated to be great Americans. So that's the legacy I want to bring. Our history and civics education is woeful in this country. We don't teach our children what it takes to be an American, the great history of our country. So that's what I want to bring to this office. Let me share a few things that we're doing. One of the things you may have heard as the legislature was in session was the call for more funding to the classroom and get 5% more money into the classroom. And that's a great and admirable goal. I have no problem with that. I don't control that. I don't control funding. I don't write bills. I can't raise taxes, can't do any of that. But what can I do as the superintendent of public instruction? Well, one of the things we can do, and we will be doing, we'll be announcing the committee very soon, is taking a look at what's called Title 15, which is the part of the Arizona Revised Statute that oversees education. And a good part of that is K-12 education. When I started on the Peoria School Board back in 2005, I don't know, Title 15 was maybe like this, it's now like this. What has that done to improve student achievement? What has that done to improve accountability to you, the taxpayers, parents, and all the people we need to be accountable for? My argument is, I don't think so much. I think it's tying the hands. I think it's getting in our way. So what we're going to do is bring together a committee of people who work with this every single day. We're going to bring together, it will be primarily people from school districts, because they understand how regulations or laws that we put in place over personnel, over transportation, over whatever, is increasing costs and taking money out of the classroom. So we're going to take a long, hard look at that. It's going to be an annual event, so this committee, their goal, they'll start their work in June. We want them to bring recommendations to me by December at the latest, so we can put legislation together to bring to our legislators and say, you know what, if we just get rid of these simple things. Some of these things, quite honestly, folks, were somebody's great idea 20 or 30 years ago, and they're still in statute and we still have to comply with them. So I think we're long overdue cleaning that up. I wanted to talk about my listening tour a little bit, and I wanted to speak about it in terms of some of the things I campaigned on and how it interacts with that. When I ran, I don't think it's any secret that I was opposed to that little federal program called Common Core. Did anybody hear that along the way? Yeah. So I'm opposed to it. I'm opposed to the federal government telling us how to educate our children. I'm opposed to them using money to drive things in education from a federal level. Let me tell you a little story. Since I've been in office, I had an opportunity to go to Washington. Went to Washington, D.C., and I actually had a private meeting with Secretary Duncan, who is President Obama's education czar. And we also had a luncheon, and he was talking to the, I was there, it was with the Council of Chief State School Officers, and those are my counterparts from all across the nation. Here's an interesting little fact I'll throw out of the superintendents of public instruction across the nation. As recently as maybe 10 years ago, there were about half of us that were elected and half that are appointed by the governor. We're now down to 13 who are elected by the people to represent them. The states and the governors are taking over that position and making them an appointed position. So I think we need to protect that office. It's the only elected voice you have at the state level to represent you in education. Everybody else is appointed, and believe me, there's dozens of unelected appointed boards that are influencing education policy. So back to Washington and the Chief State School Officer. So that's who I was there with, and we had a luncheon with Secretary Duncan, and he was explaining to us why it's so very important that the states must go along, and one of the non-negotiables in the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind / the ESEA, Elementary Secondary Education Act, is the assessment, and why we have to have this onerous assessment on our children, and why it's got to be under certain circumstances. And I'm quoting him, and he says, because when we give you our money, we have to make sure you do the right thing with it. And I was sitting next to the superintendent from Oklahoma, and I said, funny, where I come from, the people think it's our money that we're giving them, taking a cut off the top, and they're just giving a little bit back to us. So that kind of gives you an understanding of how very different the thinking is in Washington from how we think about things out here. So anyway, I campaigned against Common Core. I don't believe in the federal government. I don't believe anybody in Washington knows better than we do what's best for our children here in Arizona. But I also made no bones during the campaign of the limitations I understand of the office that I hold. I can't go like this and put in new standards, nor do I necessarily think it would be right for me to impose just like these were imposed upon us. It needs to be a discussion of the community of how we go about making education better for our children. It used to be in statute that our standards, when we test our kids, what tests we use, all that, that was changed in 2013 by House Bill 2425. Now it says the standards are up to our unelected State Board of Education. So we can change standards either by a recommendation to the State Board, we can do it through legislation. House Bill 2190 would have done that this year, but that was defeated. Or we could make recommendations to the governor, and possibly he could advance things like that. But I can't do that. But what I can do is go out and talk to the people, and this is what our listening tour is all about, offering opportunities for parents and classroom teachers to come and share their concerns with me, raise their issues that they've seen with their children's education. These are people that were not invited to the table when we made the changes back in 2010. So I think it's important that we bring them in now. I intend this to be an annual thing. We are going out. We're through the first, 17, I forget how many. I think I've done the first 6 stops, first 6 locations, and I'll be doing 8 more, taking this week to be here. I was in Fountain Hills and then here. That's why we didn't schedule this weekend. Next weekend is Memorial Day. Then the weekend after that, we'll be out again. We'll gather the information and then we'll spend some time at the department taking a look at it. We know, already we know, some will be standards, some will be curriculum, some will be testing issues, some will be funding issues. All kinds of things are being brought up here. And then I'm going to go back out again in the fall and start talking to the people. Here's the things we believe we can do. I can make this recommendation to the legislature. I can take this to the State Board of Ed. Hopefully the State Board of Ed will want to listen to me, but that's fun times, let's just say. So that's the intent of that, and I intend to do that every year that I'm privileged to hold this office, so that the people who have elected me have a true opportunity to give input into how our education system is running. So from that, I can't change the standards, but I can certainly make recommendations to make sure. And another thing, I forgot to mention this at Fountain Hills this morning. One of the big debates around Common Core is that they were created by basically a not-for-profit company. They weren't a coalition of states, as they would have you believe. It was actually a private not-for-profit that developed them, but then the copyright was held by the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association. Well, in my dealings with the Council of Chief State School Officers, I now have a letter for Arizona that says we're released from the copyright and we can do whatever we want to make those standards the best they can be for our children. So we look forward to working with all the stakeholders to make sure we're doing the best thing for our children. One other thing I want to touch on, and then I would rather do Q&A, but I wanted to talk a little bit about ethnic studies and what's going on down in Tucson. Several years ago, actually it was under Superintendent Tom Horn, there was a change to the law, because what they were doing down in Tucson was literally taking students and segregating them by nationalities, if you will, and teaching different versions of history. And a lot of the stuff they were teaching was very insightful to race relations, if you want to put it that bluntly, and was causing a lot of hate, anger. That's not what we should be doing with our children. So the law was passed that it's now illegal in Arizona to teach sedition to children. It's exactly as it should be. As John Huppenthal left office, he sent a letter to Tucson basically saying if they didn't change things within 60 days, the alternative was to take 10% of their funding away. So as I came in office, we've been sending, and we continue to send people down there on a weekly basis and are monitoring the classrooms to look and see what they're teaching children. They have to send up lesson plans. They have to send up lists of the materials they're using so that we can keep an eye on them. When the 60 days came to pass, which was the beginning of March, quite frankly, we hadn't seen any of the illegal activity going on. We were convinced that the instruction down there is not up to snuff and what we would hope it would be for children, but we didn't see anything that was a violation statute. But what we told them is we're going to continue monitoring you, we're going to continue working with you, and make sure that you stay in compliance with the law. Well, one of the bigger pieces I want to see come from that is how we develop our standards so that they're what I consider accurate and inclusive standards for teaching history, not only of Arizona, but of America. Because to me, it just makes no sense if we take this group of kids, put them over here and teach them one thing, and we take this group of kids and we put them over here and we teach them another thing. That's how we're dividing our children, and we're dividing ourselves as a society. Arizona, how can you possibly teach the history of Arizona without understanding the influence of the Native Americans, without understanding the influence of Mexico on our history and how it has evolved? How can we understand America's history without understanding, go back to Pilgrims, Great Immigration, all the different nationalities, all the different people who are just vibrantly wanting to come here and make this a better place because of what a wonderful country we are and the blessings that we've had as a nation. And that's what I believe we should be teaching our children. So that's what, as we go through standards reviews, things that I will recommend to the State Board of Ed so that we're doing things inclusive. Just really briefly, another thing, for those of you who may not know a lot about the Common Core standards, we now call them Arizona's College and Career Ready standards. They're in English language and math. But English language is considered, or subtitled, if you will, standards for history, social studies, science, and technology. So the problem is we're taking these standards, and let's think about history or social studies, and you're rolling them into English language to be taught by an English language arts teacher, not a historian. The Gettysburg Address is important for our children to know, but it's also relevant for our children to know in a historical context. You can't study it from English language that it's grammatically correct, the sentence structure is right, here's just the contents and thought, dry and cold. They have to be understood within the context of the Civil War, and that comes from a strong history curriculum. So we can't push that off the shelf and pretend that it's not important. We have to make sure we go back to teaching history, civics, and geography, so our children understand those subjects, not this thing that we now call social studies, which actually goes back to when I was in school, how long some of these things have been going on. So with that, that's kind of the thoughts I wanted to share, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Mark?